Welcome to part 11 of the Building the Rick and Morty app series. In the last part, we started talking a little bit about pagination. We added this cool spinner at the bottom. And in this video, we're going to actually attempt to load in more characters and actually populate our grid here, aka collection view. So start by dropping a like as per usual, say hello in the comments for the algorithm, and let's jump right in. So what we already have set up is we're already actually calling this function right here, right? So we're already saying, go ahead and start fetching additional characters. So one thing that we're going to modify is we need to get the URL to actually fetch, right? But our service, right, if we start writing rm service shared, we need to actually turn that URL into a rm request, right? And we also want to provide the expecting type and a completion handler. So let's amend this function to take in a URL. And what I'll do inside of here is not only am I going to be checking these conditions, but I'm going to say that the next URL string will be API info.next. That'll be the next URL string. And then we're going to also use this to create a URL. So we're going to say this will be URL with a string next URL string. Let me just line break this as well. And let's go ahead and fix all this indentation with Control I. Now we can actually specify here URL, right? And we'll jump into this function here, and now we have a URL in here. So how do we translate a URL to a RM request? So we're going to jump to RM request, and the way I'm going to do that is by hitting Command-Shift-O. If you're not familiar, it's an easy way to search for any file in your project. Once we have a bunch of files, it's way faster than actually looking for it in the left navigation. So if you see this pop up, that's what I'm doing. So in RM request, we have this single initializer. We have to pass in the endpoint, and that's a little inconvenient. It would be cool if we added another convenience initializer, which will be optional. In other words, it may or may not succeed in initialization. And this is going to take in the URL. We're going to parse this URL and attempt to get back the initialized RM request. So parsing the URL is something that we're going to actually unit test later as well, and it's rather simpler than how it sounds. So we're going to first get the URL string by just saying, give me the absolute string of this. And I'm going to go ahead and say if string contains constants.base URL, we're good to go. So we're going to say if it doesn't contain at least the base URL, we're in trouble because that's the bare minimum that we need. And as a refresher, that's basically rickandmortyapi.com/API. So if it doesn't include that, we're probably not in good shape. So just, exit early. I'm also going to now just trim the string with saying string, and we are going to say replacing occurrences of, and we are going to replace the base URL plus a slash with basically nothing. And we're going to start parsing this trimmed URL. So the first thing I'm going to do is say if trimmed contains a slash, we want to do something. The other thing I'll do is if trimmed doesn't contain that, but it does contain if it does contain a question mark if we want to do something. Otherwise, something went wrong, we're just going to return nil. So in this case, if we have base URL.com/character, we want to get, we're trimming this out in the replace up above. And let's say there's another slash here. We want to get the first thing by splitting the string, the trimmed string, by the slash. So we'll say components is going to be trimmed, and we're going to split it by the slash. And what I'm going to go ahead and do here is say if the components isn't empty, we can actually get the first element, which will be the endpoint string, spell that correctly, endpoint string, which will be the 0th, aka first element. And now we can actually create a RM endpoint via a string. And the reason we can do that is this enum has a raw value type of string. So I can actually go ahead and say that this is going to be let RM endpoint, and this is going to be RM endpoint with a raw value of the string that we have parsed out. Now this thing in its own right is going to be optional, so we do need to unwrap it. And if we successfully have gotten it, we are just going to pass this RM endpoint here and just return, so we stop the execution of this function. So it looks complex, but it's basically just manipulating a string. And let's do the exact same thing here. We're going to literally copy and paste this, and later on we're going to fix this code smell since we're making code redundant. So we're going to check if there's a question mark in this case. If there is, we're going to split by it, right? So let's see, in this case, we have a question mark. We're checking if we have it. We're going to replace by it. And once we've separated it, the first element we expect to be our endpoint. Once again, we're going to create an endpoint and try to initialize with it. So now that we've got this thing here, let's jump back to where our view model code was. And here we're going to try to create a request. So I'm going to say guard-let request is going to be a RM request, and we're going to create it with the URL. And we need a guard-let because this initializer can actually return nil in case we pass in, like apple.com or something. Once we have a request, we're going to attempt to execute it. And I'm just going to guess that the response we get is going to be very similar to the response that we got previously, the RM get all characters response that we've previously built out. And then, of course, we get our result. I'm going to switch on the results, and let's just start by printing out whatever the heck that we get back in the success case, as well as in the failure case. And one thing to note is that we do want to reset this to false if we do fail to create a request. I'm also going to print out failed to create request, and I'll also print here that we are fetching, spell that correctly, fetching more characters. Let's go ahead and build and run. I know we did a lot. And okay, so first things first, something weird is going on. We already see a bunch of prints here. So looks like it's already fetching more characters as soon as the app opens, which is strange, right? We don't want to do that. We only want to fetch more as soon as we go to the bottom. So what I'm going to do is, if you recall, we have this cell view model thing up here, which is a collection of the view models for what we've loaded already. We're going to come down here and do two things. We're going to add a new check, and let me do it up here. And I'm going to make sure that the cell view models isn't empty, right? So if this is empty, there's no reason to check if we're at the bottom, right? Because we're still loading the initial batch of data. The other thing that I'll do, which is a common practice with, when a user is typing or doing something, you want to basically delay an action. We're just going to add a small action here, delay action. We're going to say timer, schedule with an interval, say 2.2 of a second. We don't want to repeat, and we're going to have a block here where we'll toss all of our code. We're going to capture self in a weak capacity, since we definitely don't want to leak memory. And we're just going to tell the timer to invalidate itself. In other words, like, just clean yourself up. And what this will do is once it gets to this block of code, it's going to wait 0.2 seconds before it tries to execute it. And the reason that that will fix the problem is when it then calculates the offset, it'll realize that we're at the top since we have all these grid cards loaded. So we'll go ahead and build and run. We don't see any prints, which is awesome. We'll come down here, and now we get all of our jazz printed out here. So it looks like, we scroll up, we got fetching more characters, and it looks like this was called multiple times. So something weird is definitely going on with that. So we don't want to be seeing this multiple times. So let's see why that is actually happening. So we get our response here. It looks like our response was indeed correct. And let's see why that is. We only want to see this being printed once. Let me go ahead and comment out the actual API call. And let's see what's going on here. We're going to debug together, live and in action. All right, we just got a bunch of prints, so that is not good. So let's come back here, and let's see what's going on. So inside of this check, I think what's happening is because we're queuing this with a timer, we're actually queuing multiple of these. So inside of here, since we are setting this to true, I am going to add another guard and make sure this thing is false, right? If it's false, we can continue. Otherwise, if we've already called that function once, we certainly don't want to redundantly fetch something. So it'll come down, and we now have a single print, despite the fact that maybe the caller is calling it a few times. Okay, cool. So now that we have actually set this up and we are appropriately able to, make a request, what do we want to do? So once we get our response here, we want to capture self, similar to when we did our initial fetch in a weak capacity. And we want to overwrite the API info that we held on this view model because now the next URL must have changed. So essentially, I am going to actually take what we've done in the initial fetch, and I'm going to move it down here. Let's rename this to response model. We have our new results. So I'm going to say new results, or I'll say more results, more accurate probably. So we're going to update this API info, makes sense. We don't want to overwrite characters. What we actually want to do is we want to append the contents of more results, since it's additive. And then instead of telling our delegate that we've loaded the initial set of characters, what we actually want to do is we want to tell the collection view that, okay, you need to update the fact that there are now new characters. So let's add a new delegate function for that. And before I actually forget to do so, let's also now come down here and say that isLoading is going to now be false. And I'm going to actually do it after we inform the delegate. And we also want to do it over here in the failure case. You might be wondering why we didn't just put it up here, and I'm doing that in case we inadvertently start another fetch for more data again. We're gonna wait for our grid of characters up here to in fact be updated. So let's actually come to the delegate up here and let's add a new function. So we have this initial load one. I'm gonna add it right below it. I'm gonna say func did load more characters, let's say with count maybe. And let's see what we actually want to do here, because we want to know how many cells that we want to go ahead and insert. So I guess we'll pass it an integer of the total cells that we do have. So let's go ahead and call this function down here. And I'll refresh your memory. Whenever we assign to characters, we actually do create new view models. So I'm going to say creating view models. And this part is already additive. We're appending, we're not actually overwriting the view models. So let's come down here again, and here we're gonna say, on the delegates, we added a new function. So I'm gonna say did load more characters, and the new count of characters that we have is going to be our self.characters.count, and it is nullable, so I will coalesce it to 0. It should never in fact be 0. If I try to compile, let's see why this is yelling at me. It looks like we don't conform to that protocol since we did add that new function. So I am going to go ahead and bring in that new function, did load more characters with count. And this is the fun stuff. If we go ahead and build and run, we should see that there's no problem here, right? No problem at all whatsoever. And we do see the fact that creating view models is called a variety of times. So let me get rid of that print. It's a little noisy. And what we want to do here is we want to tell the collection view to add more cells. And the way we can do that is by saying perform, and we want to perform batch updates. So we're going to say batch updates, perform batch updates, and we have a closure here, and we also have a completion handler that you can implement, which is optional. You don't need to, you can know when the job is completed. But inside of here, we're going to say collection view, and let's see if I remember how to do this. We'll say self.collection view. We want to insert items, and we want to insert them at a particular index path. So let's see how on earth we're going to insert them. So we should probably specify that via the arguments. We want to create a collection of index paths. So how do we do that? So what I'm going to do is we're going to change this function. So did load more characters with new index paths, and this is going to be a collection of index path, and we're just going to simply pass this into here. And I want to say there is a function on here along the lines of begin updates. Let's see if that actually does exist. Yep, so there is begin. Nope, there's not. I take it back. That's something else. So we actually don't need that. That might be a table view construct that I'm thinking of, but we are going to go back to our view model for our character list, and I'm going to change this to be what we had updated. And we now need to derive the new set of index paths that we are updating with. So we're going to go ahead and have to calculate that here. So we know the initial set of characters and how many we had, right? So here we have our more results. So what I'm going to do is we're going to say that The original count is going to be self, and this will basically be our characters.count. Now all these optionals is going to start to get super annoying, so we are going to unwrap it. I'll go ahead and say strong self is self. This is a very common technique that you'll see across iOS apps. We're going to change all of these self optionals to strong self so we can avoid the nullability. So here we have our original count. Our new count is more or less just going to be our more results.count. And we kind of just want to subtract these and find the new indices to add. So the total is the original plus the new, makes sense. So let's say this is 20, this will be 40. What we want to actually do is we want to say that the starting index of the insert operation that we're going to do will be the total subtracting the new count. Now, I believe we actually want to subtract one more because we enumerate this from 0, right? The first index starts at 0, so this will be 0 to 19 for 20 elements. This will be 20 to 39, I guess, if I'm not mistaken. And then total will be a total of 40. So when we do 40 minus 20, we actually get 20, but we want to start off at 19 if my math is correct. We'll adjust as needed. So now what we can do is we're going to go ahead and say, create an array. So what we're going to do is we're going to say index paths to add is going to be an array of index path objects. And we're going to create an array from the starting index through starting index plus the new count. And we're going to go ahead and say compact map this, in other words, iterate over this, and return an index path where the row is the number and the section is 0. We have only one section, aka section 0. Let's see why this is yelling at me, and we will figure it out. It's saying we're not using this, which makes sense. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and print this and see what we actually get. So let's build and run and make sure nothing is breaking. Let's open up our console, which has no prints yet. We're going to come down here, and we do see a couple things being printed. We see this, so we see index path 0 and then 19, 20, and this should go all the way. It looks like the 38 is where it's going. So I actually don't know if 19 is correct. We might actually not need to subtract 1 because 19 is already in use, because 20 elements would get to index 19. So instead of just printing it now, let's actually just pass this in, and we should see the collection view batch update and add some cells. So let's see it in action. So I'll scroll down. We'll keep scrolling, and we should see some more cells. And if you look at that, we do in fact see more cells, but I see a problem. The problem that I see is that it looks like we're repeating elements. So it appears that page 2 here has just repeated the same element. So let's see why the heck that's happening. So it looks like at least we are, things are working and not crashing, but they're not working correctly. So we're going to debug this together before ending this video. So let's see how we do. So I'm going to print out the more results .count. So let's actually see what we're getting in here. And I'm also going to print out the first element's name inside of here and see what we actually get. So we can see here we start off with Rick and Morty. Super shocker that those are the first 2 characters. And as we scroll down here, we should get to the spinner and we should see more stuff. So it looks like we're printing out 20 more elements and we're getting Rick again. And that seems like it's an API error actually. So let's see why that in fact is indeed happening. So let's see. So first of all, where is this print coming from? We're going to try to find it. So let's get rid of these. So let's actually leave these here. We're getting Rick again. And it looks like we're calling this delegate function. So let's go to where it's implemented because it is in fact. So actually, I think the reason, I'm just looking at the console here, it says performing reload data as a fallback because it was invalid update. Invalid number of items in section 0. The number of items contained in an existing section of the update, 60, must be equal to the number of items contained in the section before the update, 20, plus or minus the change. Okay, so somehow we're getting 60 elements. That is not good. So let me print out the count of indices to add that we created. That should not be higher than 20. And I think I know what's happening here. So it looks like we are indeed adding 20, but it's for some reason we're saying to the collection view, hey, you should have 60 cells now, which is totally not correct. And I want to say this function is being called twice. So let's see why in fact that is. So I'm going to add a print here, fetching more data. And my hunch is if we actually get rid of assigning this to false, we'll see an appropriate update, and we'll need to just delay that is loading indicator to false so we don't have an issue. So let's go down. All right, we're loading more data, and now we actually it looks like we still have the same data. So let's see what the heck is going on. So it looks like we're still getting 60, which is definitely not correct. So we're saying did load more characters, okay. So let's see what's going on in here. I'm going to command click into this, and instead of the definition, we're going to move to the actual view where this is implemented. And here we're basically saying insert items, and we have new index paths. So let's see what's going on. So I'm going to read the wording down here. It's actually pretty helpful to just read the warnings. So 20 were inserted, 20 were deleted, plus or minus the number of items moved into or out of that section. 20 moved in, 20 moved out. It's a collection view. It gives you a reference to that collection view, which is not relevant. So let's see, before the update, there were 20, and it's saying that there are 60 elements after the update. So something super weird is going on. So I am going to print out what is going on. We might be duplicating the view models if I have to guess what's actually going on here. So let me print out pre-update. The count is going to be self, it'll be strong self dot view models dot count, and then I'm going to do post update, which I guess I will print out down here, which is going to be, which should be, I should say, 40. So let's go ahead and give this a run. We have nothing here at the moment, which is great. We'll come down here. We should now see printed out 20, and then for the post update, we should have 40. So I suspected correctly, we're actually duplicating the view model creation, right? We have 60 view models, and that's totally not correct. So let's see why that's happening. So we're adding to characters, and what we're doing is for each character, we're looping and creating a view model again. So that's a pretty obvious mistake. We are redundantly creating these. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to say loop over the characters where this particular view model collection, these cell view models, doesn't contain a view model where the character's naming is already there. So let me actually write that out, and I'll reverbalize it. So where cell view models contains where $0.name, character name, equals character. Let me actually close this left panel so we have a little more room here. So we're going to say only loop over the characters where the view model doesn't contain a thing with the character's name already. In other words, if a view model already exists with the current character's name that we're about to loop over, don't loop over it. Now, this is on a big assumption that every character has a unique name, but that's a bet I'm willing to make. So let's go ahead and build and run again. And we're going to open up our console here. We're going to scroll down here, and let's see what actually happens. So now we're crashing, so that's not good, but at least it's progress. We're saying that we initially, pre-update, had 20, and it looks like we're not actually getting to the post-update. So let's see why we're crashing. I'll fix it together. It's saying that attempt to insert item 20 in section, but there are only 20 items. Okay, so let's see what's going on. I'm going to scroll down here where we wrote all of our logic out, and we're actually going to see what's going on here. So we appended these. Alrighty, let's go ahead and comment this out. So we're going to see what we have post update. I suspect my index paths to add are now incorrect. So no crash. So pre-update, we have 20, and post-update, we also have 20. So that is not good. We should have a total of 40 view models. So let's see what's going on. So it looks like we are actually getting Rick Sanchez back again for this particular API call. So let's see why that actually is, because what's happening here is indeed correct, such that we're getting the same character over and over. So maybe the API actually doesn't return different characters. And this will be news to me as well. So let's go over here. We're gonna go to character, we'll copy and paste it. And it looks like this first character here is in fact Rick Sanchez. I'm gonna click on the next link, and it looks like now we get the first character, which is the Aqua Morty. So it looks like it is in fact different. So let's see what's going on. So this should be page 2, and let's see what's happening. I think I know what's happening. A critical mistake actually we made, which I just realized, is when we actually created the RM request, one thing that we're omitting here is the fact that we're splitting off the get parameters, the query parameters, and we're not including them. So the URL that is actually being triggered by the RM service is actually just getting the initial set of characters over and over. So a really good way that we can actually debug this, and I can actually prove that that's the problem, is we can say, give me the URL's absolute string that we are making a call to. So I'm going to go ahead and say API call, and we're going to stick inside of here the API endpoint that we're making a call to. All right, that makes sense. We go to the bottom, we should see page 2, and we don't see that, which is the exact problem, because we are simply getting rid of that information when we parse this out. So let me go ahead and include that info, and then we should hopefully see everything working. So now that we have broken out the components from the question mark, what we can actually go ahead and do is we can say we want to get the components after the question mark. So we'll say query items, and this query item is essentially going to be everything in components at position 1. We're going to also be safe and say make sure the components count is greater than or equal to 2 before we access one of these indices. And the way that query parameters generally look is along the lines of value equals name, and then value equals name, so on and so forth. So what we can actually now do is say that the query items is going to be the query item string, and we're going to separate this component. So we're going to say components separated by the and symbol. And now we can just actually create these URL query items. So I can actually go ahead and say compact map this collection, this array, and return a URL query item. And this gets created with a name and a value. So let's actually do that. So each of these elements, when we split it by the and, we should have a string with an equal in it. So I'm going to go ahead and call this name and value, and we're going to create it up here. So we're going to say guard that the current element contains an equal sign. If it doesn't, then we can just return nil. That's not a valid query item. Otherwise, what we can go ahead and do is say, we can say parts is going to be $0 components separated by, so let's do that again, components, and we want separated by, and we're going to separate this by the equal. All right, looking good. And then the name will be the first part of this parts collection, and this will be the second part. And if we go ahead and try to compile, hopefully we don't have any issues. Let's see what's going on. Looks like this is yelling at me. So it's saying generic parameter element of results could not be inferred. Basically, it's saying like, what is this thing going to be? This is going to be a URL query item array, like so. And now that we actually have these, if you recall, the RM request does in fact take in query items. So we can pass in query parameters like so. Go ahead and give this a build and run, and now we expect to see the appropriate URL down below when we paginate. So now we get page equals 2, and we can try to update the correct actual size of elements. It looks like we started off initially with 20 elements, and now we're actually at 38 elements. So it's not exactly 40, so we don't want to make that assumption. So let's jump back to our view model. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is we're going to calculate things correctly. So in this case, we're going to say how many new elements do we have, because what we have hard-coded here is not correct. And the other thing I'll call out is we now have a brand new name that we're printing. We're printing out Aqua Morty. So we'll get rid of that, looking good. We've updated the API info. We have our print up there. So we have our original count, which is the characters.count. We have our new count. We have our total. Starting index will be the total minus new count. And we're deriving all of these. So let's see, index paths to add.count. It's actually adding presumably 20. Let's see where that print is coming from. So let me go ahead and actually just print this out. And let's see the index paths that it is in fact generating for us. All right, we should get a collection down here. All right, so it looks like we get 0 and 20, 0 and 21, and it goes all the way to 0 and 39. And it doesn't look like we actually hard-coded 20 anywhere in here. So let's actually try to get this batch update and let's see what happens. So I'm gonna uncomment all this jazz down here. We are going to remove these print statements. And if we get a weird crash, we'll still debug it together. So let's come down here. All right, let's see what happens. Looks like we are still crashing, and let's see why that is. So it's saying reason, attempt to insert item 38 into section 0, but there are only 38 items in section 0 after the update. So it's basically saying you're trying to add more elements than what actually exists. So let's see why that is. So we have a new count. So original count, we're actually using the models here, right? So we should actually have a total of 40, but it does appear that the way that we're filtering out of characters is not really correct. And the reason I assume this is happening is because we have some character objects with the same name. So instead of doing it like this, before we actually fix it, I am going to verify this by printing out what we threw into characters. Rather, how many elements are inside of here. This is going to yell at me because it wants me to wrap it in a string. And let's see, we also need to say strong self. And let's see if that in fact is 40 as I suspect it to be. All right, looks like we got our prints. Let's ignore this crash. It is in fact 40, which leads me to believe there are character objects with the exact same name, which basically has me infer that we need a more intelligent way to filter out whether something exists in here. So let's actually do that. So we are creating character view model, and we want a way to uniquely create a hash for it. So luckily, there's something called hashable. So we're going to say hashable, and the way that we can uniquely figure out the hash of something is we are going to say hasher. We're going to say hash into, and we're going to say hasher.combine the character's name, hasher.combine the character's status, and also combine the image URL. And essentially what we're doing here, let's get rid of this. What we're doing here is we are basically telling the view model, whenever it's created, what the unique hash value for it is. And by doing so, we can actually go and check more intelligently if it exists in our array. Now, this is also a part of adding hashable. It actually also forces you to conform to the protocol of equatable, which basically allows the equation of this object, whether two things are equal to one another. And the way I'm going to go ahead and do this is I'm going to say return LHS.hashValue equals RHS.hashValue. So L being left, R being right. If you go ahead and compile, we should be good to go. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say that this doesn't contain, and let's see, this doesn't contain an existing view model. So we don't want to actually do it like this. We're going to do it like this. We're going to say if this view model collection doesn't contain the new view model we have attempted to create, then and only then should you insert it. So let's see if this is correct, how many view models we actually get. Let me come down here and look at my print. This video has gotten way longer than what I planned for, but that's okay. We can figure it out together. So it looks like we're printing out the characters. Let me actually print out the view model count instead. I will prefix this view models, and let's see how we actually do. And actually what I'll probably do is let's trim the video here since it's gotten way longer than what I would have liked and what I'm trying to keep this video under. And then the next video, we'll actually get the UI updating. So drop a like down below if you haven't done so already, hit subscribe, and I'll see y'all in the next part.